Thank you for joining us for the next hour or two in this episode of Inside Myanmar podcast. In an age of nearly limitless content, we appreciate that you're choosing to take valuable time out of your day to learn more about what is happening in Myanmar. It's vital for this story to be heard by people around the world, and that starts right now with you. For this episode of Inside Myanmar podcast, we're joined by DVB founder and editor Aye Chan Naing. DVB is the Democratic Voice of Burma, and we're going to learn about how DVB has been active following the coup, as well as how it was founded and Aye Chan Naing's own journey. So thank you so much for joining us for this episode.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been my pleasure to talk to you, and I've been following your podcast for quite some time. And congratulations with your job success. And I'm happy to be, talking to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward as well into the conversation that follows and getting to know more about your media institution, one of the most important local journalism that's been covering Myanmar for some time, as well as your own personal story of how you got there. So if we can get into your personal story first, and you could talk a bit about yourself and where you came from and how you eventually found your way to activism before going to media.
I came out from Burma, during the 1988 student-led protests inside Burma. And I was a student, nothing to do with media. I was studying dentistry. But then during the uprising, of course, as a student, we were pretty close following the whole uprising and joining the demonstration on the streets. And then suddenly the military started, arresting students, killing them on the streets. There were lots of human rights violation and lots of brutalities. And that triggered me, getting more involved into activisms. And then I decided to leave the country to take up arms, in fact, to join the armed struggle from the Thai-Burma border. But then I ended up in the student army, All Burma Student Democratic Front. And I ended up in the information department just by chance, and then I started doing the publication called Dawn News Bulletin. It's once a month. And since I was involved with, news and media, I met lots of journalists, foreign journalists, and I met lots of human rights activists from like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and they needed lots of information about what's going on inside Burma. And I found myself pretty much into it. So I was into writing story and gathering information and documentation, providing lots of data to human rights groups and foreign journalists. So that's how I got into, instead of the armed struggle, I gone more into a journalism. And then in 1991, Aung San Suu Kyi got the Nobel Peace Prize. And Norwegian government was pretty eager to support. And our exile government was invited for Nobel Peace Prize ceremony And then they asked for shortwave radio to broadcast back to Burma from the Norwegian government, and to be based in Norway because it's stable and it's safe. And then the Norwegian government agree, and they provide facility for shortwave radio broadcast license and also funding for the setting up the organization. So I was not only one of the I was not the only founder. I mean, there were three other people when we started in Norway, and then there were quite a big group in Myanmar, in fact, at the time, mostly from ABSDF and other ethnic groups. So we were kind of group of young people who started the DVB.
Right. That is a story at warp speed of going from being a student, minding your own business with your studies, to being the emerging leader of a major news organization. So to break down those parts a little more, to go back to 1988, I understand at that time you were a student that was, as any student anywhere in the world, engaged in your studies, focused, it sounds like, not so much on political activism or on the process of education. And 88 came along, swept you up. You saw fellow students murdered in the streets, cold-blooded, in broad daylight by soldiers, and that set you on a life of activism, which then led to the armed struggle. But before getting to the armed struggle part of it, can you tell us more about your experience as a student, if you can take yourself back when those days started to unfold? Because at that time in 1988, there wasn't a lot of years of political activism or resistance. The military was in very firm control. 1974, of course, U Thant's funeral, something happened, but as many years where not much was really happening day to day, and this came seemingly out of nowhere and swept everything up. So as a student who was around at that time and seen it unfold, what do you remember about, as things started to pick up and there was more momentum, you started to see things, talk about things, hear things, feel things? What can you do to bring us back to the color of those moments?
In fact, even though I started, actively joining the anti-government demonstration, growing up, we were all pretty much aware of injustice in the country.
Yeah.
And pretty much aware. We talk about at home, on the dinner table, because this whole injustice, it's pretty much visible.
Yeah.
And then, for me, because I was growing up in the university compound area, and pretty much close to the former student union that was exploded by General Naing, and that was that time I wasn't even born. 3-4 years later, I was born. But that area, we pass every day, and then as I grow up, my friends, my brother, my parents, they always told us about the story, and all these military former general or the general, they are every department, wherever you go, they're the boss. And all the civilian have to walk under them. And my family come from civil servant, they work in different government departments, and their boss, it's somebody, coming from the army who know nothing about their job, right? But then they want to tell what you should do, that kind of thing. Yeah. It's visible, and we never like it. And the more we grow up, the more we learn about this power imbalance. There is a ruler, it's a one class. And the general public, it's a lower class, that kind of things. Even among your friends, you have friends who parents are in the military. They behave totally different. They're quite arrogant. They show their wealth, and just simply because they are in the army. That kind of thing. It's a huge difference. But then the first experience I had was in 1975, 76, I don't remember exactly. That was during the U Thant funeral. The student took his body from the airport and they marched down to the Rangoon University to honor him, you know. And that was just outside my house, you know.
Mm.
So there were hundreds of students marching in front of our house and getting into the university compound.
Yeah.
And they occupied the university compound for a week.
Mm.
And I was like 10, 11 years old. I can hear all the, you know, speeches, sounds that they play inside the university. And every evening we walk down and listen to them, you know. They were very peaceful and very organized. And they just stay inside the university compound. And then one day there were lots of army trucks and tanks like rolling in, you know, in front of our house and going to the Rangoon University.
Mm-hmm.
There was like 4 or 5 early in the morning, lots of soldiers, and we started hearing gunshots like around 7, 8, and there were lots of students running away, and some of them even come through our compound, and we saw. I saw the soldiers. There were lots of Buddhist men too, and the students. They were like, because we have a big compound with lots of houses, so they were all hiding in different places, and then when the soldier came in, they took them, they beat them. I see it in front of my eyes, you know, from my house, including the monk, and they were many students were arrested. So growing up in Burma, you kind of really, even if you don't want to, right? But all these things happening, this injustice, it's happening in front of you, your daily life, you know. It's kind of driving you this politics into your mind, like something is not right. And I would say after U Thant affair, they shut down the university for like 2-3 years. And then when the university opened, they introduced every university students have to learn political science. I think that's the major mistake. They thought they can you know, do their propaganda. And of course, the socialism is the best, right? Out of, you know, all the different political ideologies. And when I got to university, I have to learn political science. But then you're even more clear, visible, you know, what they teach you. It's totally different from what's happening in the real life,
right.
You know. That's their socialism, but they just said it. That's on the paper, but in reality, it's a total different, right? And that driven many students, I think, even more into politics.
So it sounds like when 1988 was beginning, this wasn't something for you that was this activism came from nowhere and suddenly you were animated. It sounds like you were growing up with the awareness of this injustice and this brutality throughout your life, and 88 was a trigger, it was a spark that allowed you to act.
Exactly. I mean, like among your friends, like when I got to university, you know, when we go for sit in the tea shop, because that's lots of students do. Most of the time we just talk about politics. I mean, politics mean like day-to-day politics, like, you know, not like a big ideology, you know, that kind of thing. But this is not right, you know. So the exactly. I mean, it's 88. It's a trigger, but there have been many years of building up to that stage, right?
So you have those years of building up where you're having these whispered, hushed conversations in tea shops with close friends who you can trust, slowly building up, not really manifesting in any real tangible ways in the streets. 88 was a complete reversal of that in terms of the activity that was visible, not just in the city nationally, but internationally is now covering this coming to the fore. What did it feel like to be a student at that time and have these concerns that had long been on your mind and had been issues of contention and frustration, and suddenly have them in the air publicly for all to see?
Um, I would say, the student life was quite nice. In fact, it's quite relaxed and it's enjoyable during those days. You've got many friends you can go and visit, but then again, like with this political in mind, you kind of almost waiting for the time to come, to start the revolution.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, unconsciously, right? So the minute the 88 started, from the beginning, we started jump in, It started from the Institute of Technology, pretty far, like at the time, I mean, outside of Yangon. And then it quickly spread to Rangoon University. And then from Rangoon University, it spread into the town, like medical university, like my institute, the Dental Institute. That's in the downtown Yangon. So it's like a forest fire, It's really quick, mostly just among the students. But then when the military started arresting students, beating them on the streets, shooting them, and then a few months later, the general public started joining in. And then the 88 was like in August 88 was like the biggest, like, all layer of life join in, like the lawyer, doctor, nurses, teacher, everybody joined in. It was just like in the 2021 military coup, it was quite big. And many people thought at the time too, like the military would fall. We didn't believe so. I mean, we believed like there would be a coup, and we need to take up arms to fight them back, because there have been lots of peaceful demonstration, and all the demonstrations have been brutally cracked down, and they would never give up, peacefully.
Right. So 88, this is a tremendously important day in Burmese history. You were there. Can you tell us what exactly you were doing, where you were on 88, and describe the experience of what it felt like to be on a street where everyone, as you say, was there, and there was this feeling of optimism? What if we were to be transported back there today, or to see let's imagine a HD television of bringing us down to the streets, what would we see?
Yeah, 88 started in March. That's the beginning. It started from the Rangoon Technology Institute, just purely with the fight between the local and the students, and then they shot and killed one of the students, and that triggered. I mean, the next morning, in the news from the government, they accused the student as a troublemaker, the rebellion. So it was just totally one-sided, and we knew the whole story. It was a blended lie. That's already kind of create the anger inside, And then it spread into Rangoon University. I went there, and I was listening to the speeches, by the student leader. And 2 or 3 days later, it spread into our university, and it was downtown and there was students coming and giving speeches downtown in the Sule Pagoda, around that area. I was pretty close to our school, so we went down there. And that was the one incident, in fact. Sule Pagoda Road, it's pretty wide and pretty long, right? And then it was just around the Sule Pagoda, and they started shooting. So we were all running. So I don't know, they were shooting, into the sky, or they were actually shooting, but nobody was hurt.
Yeah.
But we ran like all the way to Bojok Street, and then we can walk like slowly. But that was the one incident, like close with this shooting. And then in June it started again, and July it started more and more demonstration coming up, and then the 88 there were lots of killing, and I was there, but not like close to. I mean, never really witnessed any shooting or anything, but and then you hear from other people, like somebody got killed, one of your friends got arrested or killed on the street. That's coming up a lot.
Yeah, right. So then tell me about the decision and the psychology behind your choice to move from being in the universities and on the streets protesting to then moving towards armed struggle and rebellion.
That was purely, as I said, you got into your mind that this military would never give up power unless you push them or you fight them back, right? So it wasn't really, hard decision, because it was very clear in your mind that there's no way to fight the military peacefully. So it's among my friends, three other friends of mine, we decided to leave. In fact, that was before the coup, like a month before the coup. We decided to leave and to get contact with the ethnic guerrilla group and get a military training and maybe even, smuggle arms back to the country. Because we were quite sure there would be a coup and there would be another crackdown, there would be much more killing. But then again, 3 days after we reached to Thailand, there was a coup already. And that was started shooting, killing, and then many hundreds, thousands students also left to Thai-Burma border.
So were you one of the first groups of students who tried to make contact with the ethnic armed groups? And can you tell us more about what that encounter was like?
I think, we had like one of the first group to get in touch with the ethnic group. But in a way, it was quite disappointing, because the ethnic group, they don't know what's going on inside Burma. They had no idea. There were very little communication for them with the inside Burma. Even though, the army, after the coup, they say that this whole uprising was organized by the Communist Party of Burma. It wasn't true at all. The PCP, they didn't even know. Or, they're not really aware, and the KNU and the MON, even the Kachin, they had no idea, or maybe just a little bit idea, but they were not really aware of what's happening within Burma. And I think also it's an interesting experience, in fact, because it's decades of Burmese army brutality against ethnic minority group, this trust of the Burman by the ethnic groups are very, very low.
Yeah.
So they don't trust you.
Yeah.
And for them, they see, Burman and the Burman. They don't see the difference between the Burma army and the general public, right? I mean, the general public are the same oppressed by the Burma army, just like the ethnic group. But of course, they get more woes. There were lots of rape and torture and killing by the Burma army against the ethnic group. Inside Burma, you don't have that, but we're also being oppressed. But we have to, I think that's one of the big benefit of a lot of students, majority Burman left the country and taken refuge in their ethnic area. And that's sort of able to rebuild the trust and understanding. And we also don't understand, when the ethnic group don't trust us. We don't understand why, But later, after living in their area, in their places, then you start to realize, they have been oppressed for many, many years. And they lost the trust of Burman, simply. For example, like we were in, I was in Wangkar, in the Korean area when ABSDF was founded. And we were walking around in the village nearby, and there was a video theater kind of showing the different kind of film. And the title of the film was "The War Between Korean and Burman." We thought that's so strange. What Burman? It should be Burmese army.
I see. Right. Yeah. So you were present at basically the formation of the ABSDF, and when it got off the ground from being a student-led organization in protest to a student-led armed resistance tied with the ethnic armed organizations. What do you remember from the origins and the birth of the ABSDF?
I remember pretty well. I mean, I was in the first conference when even the name of the ABSDF, started. But I wasn't in the leadership role. And I was quite active, mainly with news information, documentation. And I think there were lots of, positive things. But then the problem, I think, we were not really aware of how the international community work, But we were pretty much isolated. And I realized, when I lived mostly in Bangkok at the time, working with news, and I met lots of Thai student activists, either student activists from like Malaysia, Hong Kong, Indonesia. And when we actually go to the meeting and talking to them, and then you realize how much knowledge you lack, how much knowledge they have. And we thought when we came out and set up the army, United States will come and give you training and give you lots of arms, ammunitions, There was nothing like that. And it doesn't work that way, It's always lots of this geopolitics that involve. So one thing that come out is the knowledge, the international knowledge. It's something that really lacking. And then, like when you set up the army, you need guns, ammunition, and you can forget about that because we don't even have enough fund for food, medicines, So it was a pretty hard time, and you had to build this trust with the ethnic army. They're the only one who can train militarily to all our members, So that also takes quite some time. And in terms of funding, it's very, because no one want to. There were a few organizations that provide fund for the student along the border, but most of them only provide food and medicine. Nothing related to for the military activity. So that's also another big issue. And a lot of students got malaria, all these pretty hard diseases. So after like a year or two, many students went back to inside Burma. And then some students left for that country. I think that's, but the important, it's like, as I said, the ABSDF is the first Burman majority group that really sort of build the trust, rebuild the trust with the ethnic armed groups. And that's a very important point, I think.
It's very interesting that you describe that first conversation of when I asked you what you remember of that first conversation, I was expecting that there would be some dialogue about the ways you have to build trust or the ways you're going to work together. And I have to confess, it surprised me that your answer was that they didn't know what was happening. And now that I think about it, that shouldn't be so surprising. Of course, the state of media in the world at that time anywhere without the internet, and then compounded in a military dictatorship that has such a strong reign on suppressing free press everywhere. But it really is something to think that your first conversation was probably before you got to the trust or the cooperation or the collaboration or the, let alone strategy part of it. The first conversation was, let me tell you what's been happening these last 6 months in Yangon.
Yeah, exactly. And they don't know how big it was. And then they don't know how to help. I mean, and then of course this trust is a big gap. You can't just build the trust like the next day. It takes a long time to gain trust each other. That's this Burmese military propaganda. It walks quite some length. I mean, not that people believe in their propaganda, but they can actually cut the information, without the internet. Even the landline, it was not everybody has it. It's a very rare, if you're only in the government position, then you could get it. Like even in the government position, you have to be quite high up, to get a landline. For example, like, I left from Yangon and I went to Margui, which is like birthplace of my father, and I have my grandmother, I have my aunts, and my parents didn't know I was going there. But then I told my aunts, my parents sent me here because I was keep going on the demonstration, and they want me to be, in her place. She kind of believed it, but there was no way she can call my parents home in Yangon. There was no telephone line. The only way they can communicate is by telex. And I lived there for 1 week, and after 1 week, she realized, in fact, that I was leaving the country. But I lived there for 1 week, and then I left to another town. And the telex for Yangon only arrived after I left the town. So that's how, the information flow took a long time. So they can effectively cut off quite a lot. I mean, maybe no surprise like why ethnic group don't really know what's happening.
Mm, mm. So then after that preliminary conversation where you explained to them what's been happening in 1988, these monumental events, what you want to do, and this is a really unprecedented time in the history of the country and the people. This is first time in modern history that I can think of where a Bamar urban population is fleeing to the rural ethnic areas, asking for help, asking for serious help of wanting to resist their own countrymen, their own Bamar military to join together. And this is something that kind of breaks the brain maybe at the time, and thinking about these new alignments and alliances being formed. So you have that conversation, you stay, your group does stay for some time, not months, but years, trying to live and train despite the hardships and the conditions. Um, Eventually, it didn't result in any real achievable victories on the battlefield or in actually in fighting, but certainly connections are made, they're forged. You're able to have some kind of relationship. What do you remember from those months and years that you spent in being in the company with your fellow young Mar students and in getting to know on a personal level the ethnic communities and living in those villages and rural places for as long as you did?
To be honest, I wasn't that involved. I mean, after a while, I was mostly in Bangkok. Then I was involved dealing with the ethnic relationship. But what I can say, it's ABSDF. I mean, play a pretty big role, like this building the bridge between the ethnic groups and the Burman, because after 1990 election, many of the parliamentarians also left Burma. And they had the same situation like us too, right? Because they don't know what the ethnic groups are feeling, but we already knew because we were there like 2 years earlier, so we can also bring the gap, and not only that, but also gradually, after several years, we started talking about drafting the federal constitution, and that's gone really quite far.
Yeah.
It's and there were lots of delegation with people from BBSTF, people from exile government, and then people from the ethnic groups. So that even closed the gap, with the ethnic group. And there were quite some alliances that kind of forming up. And before like 2010, there was like National Council of Union of Burma. That's like a big umbrella, group with exile government and other Burman majority organization like ABSDF, DBNS, Democratic Party for New Society, and the NLD also left. Some of the NLD members also left. So I think that's the, even though there was no tangible, like, big achievement, but this relationship, it's a pretty important, and I think it's paid the way now, like, now the younger generation that come out after the coup. But the groundwork has already done, and of course the whole situation is totally different. With the whole communication.
What you're saying reminds me. There's a filmmaker friend I have in Yangon whose father was active in '88, and he said, this was soon after the 2021 coup. He said, I get really frustrated by outside observers saying that every time we've tried to resist the military, every cycle in '07 and '88 and '74, we've always failed. The military has always won. And so this time is going to be the same. He said, that's not the way I view history. The way I view it is that every time we've resisted, we've learned something new. We've made some connection, we've forged some path. It hasn't been far enough, and that's why we've fallen down. But every time we're gaining knowledge, and then the elder generation is sharing with the new generation what that knowledge is, for them to try things in a new way. And so he was in the very early stages of 2021. He was very optimistic that this time was going to be different, and that the narrative that the military always wins is a flawed narrative, because it wasn't this black and white situation of the military just holding all the cards and winning every time. It was that the resistance and the youth were doing what they could to move the ball just a little further, but they didn't have the resources. It wasn't far enough. And he felt this was the time they'd be able to put it all together. And we're still not there yet, but certainly this has played out very, very differently than any other period.
Which is quite true. I mean, and not only that, but also, you know, the whole entire population in Burma with this military coup, you know, are all oppressed. I mean, there was no generation left without their oppression.
Yeah.
Like my parents' generation, they were oppressed by the army. And obviously our generation was oppressed. And now the younger generation are oppressed. So there is three generations being oppressed. And it means like, because in 88, I mean, after the coup, they cracked down for 3 days, or maybe 4 days. And then everything quiet, you know. And there was the option of joining the election. And many people went into the election, including Aung San Suu Kyi. And things quickly back into, you know, normal inside Burma. So you can say, there lots of people say, "Oh, I'm not interested in politics." You know, it's for those who want to involve, they can involve. But this time around, I mean, you don't see that kind of people. You don't see people like sitting on the gray area. It become and it's again, of course, it really polarized the whole society, right? Either you're with me or you're against me, you know. And that's because everyone is affected, and that's these army military, you know, they never learn from their own mistake, because even though, you know, the things come back quite quickly after the coup in 1988, there were still lots of activists, you know, who didn't join the election, who still tried to revolt against the military. There was successive student protests after 88, even though, you know, it kind of cracked down by the army. And I remember one of the activists who's been in and out of prison. I remember he was talking to one journalist, and he said, the more I got into jail, the more I stronger. If you look at the 88 generation students, you know, they got arrested, they throw into jail, and the day they came back or they were released, the next day they're out on the streets, you know. And that's the same thing here, you know. The military thought the more they oppress, the more they show their brutality, people got scared and try to avoid, you know, joining politics or try to avoid joining revolt against the army. It doesn't work that way. It's work total opposite. And now, like, they've been bombing villages, you know, the cities, really brutalized the whole, you know, village and civilian, and that really pushed. I mean, for example, like they burned down this village, and the next day the whole entire town became a BDF members, you know.
Right.
And that's what they don't realize, you know. They thought like the more they brutalize, the more people will get scared, because maybe, you know, for people there's nothing to lose, you know.
Mm.
I think that's what happening now, and also like this new regroup for the soldiers, conscription among the young people. That's again they're pushing people into the corner. Maybe those young people who are still living in Yangon, maybe they're not really interested in politics, or maybe they're not really interested in joining the PDF by themselves. They just want to, do their own usual, study or business, but now they're pushing them in the corner to make a decision. Either I leave the country or either I join the PDF. Right. I mean, they're just creating their own problem by themselves.
Mm. Mm. So getting back to your story, I want to follow your trajectory and then head back into where we are now in post-2021, and especially DVB's position in covering unprecedented ongoing conflict from exile, no less. But getting back to your origins, you explain how you were put in the media team of ABSDF, and at the time saying you don't know exactly why you were given this designation, but that's what you became. And then so, okay, suddenly you're the information minister or connection or liaison, and you then in this position you're starting to see organically informally the role that information plays to the outside world. And Burma is such a forgotten country by that point. Even whatever we say it's left out of the news today, it really pre-1988 was a different story of how little it was really being followed and regarded around the world, especially after that was the time of the fall, the Cold War. After I think there was some intrigue in the Cold War era of USSR, and where all the geopolitical stakes around the world would play. But with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of USSR, just a few years later, Burma was even less important as it went through the 90s. And so this really underscored even further the importance of trying to make relevant and get information from inside to around the world. And you had a start of that being a media officer with as a young Bamar student, which then led into wanting to carry this information war and information strategy further beyond once it became clear that the military was going to retain control. So share with us what you remember from those early days of being a media officer, whatever the term was then, and then how that started to transfer to the early grant with shortwave radios from Norway, and then developed into something else altogether.
I mean, the whole reason I got into this journalism was mainly, in fact, because of Bertil Lintner, the Swedish writer, journalist. In fact, I was staying with him for the first 3 years when I came out, and we talk a lot. And my English wasn't good at all at the time, but try to use whatever you can speak of. And he started writing the book, and sometimes I, bring some students who he can interview. And I have been kind of following his writing, also learning English, by reading it. And that's how that kind of triggered, into writing the story.
Yeah. And
then I met the American NGO worker, Max Edinger, and I was talking with him, and then somehow this idea came out of publishing a magazine, like monthly magazine. So that's how I got more into journalism, and then, as I said, I have become quite close friends, like some of the Amnesty International researcher, and I've been providing them with information about those who are in prison in Burma, and I realized how little the whole international community know about Burma.
Mm.
It's funny, like, we don't know about international community, how the
Yeah.
war function, right?
Yeah.
But the world don't know what's happening in Burma
Yeah.
either.
Yeah.
Like we are sort of out in the what do you call moon or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's also it's a big gap, right? And then when I saw, like, for example, what I have, reported to the Amnesty, and then I saw in the report about, the information that I have provided that give more kind of a incentive. And then later I thought I mean, getting the names of the prisoner in Burma, it's not like, they would be released the next day, but at least, like, for the army, military, need to aware, like, the whole international community know that this particular person is in your prison, and if something happens, it's you're responsible. That function in that way, I thought. So it gave me a, strength and energy to keep working on that.
Right. And so that describes the motivation that you had in wanting to move towards the direction of media, getting information out. You referenced earlier that started, it sounds like the motivation started with your friendship with Bertil Lintner, the Swedish journalist and author. And then the actual practical start came with this grant from Norway of developing shortwave radio communication back into Burma, and I imagine from there just grew organically. Is that correct?
Yes. The radio was like, I was more into the print, and more into writing the article, but the radio, it's pretty new, never really touched a microphone. And it started like, the whole living outside of Burma, it's like you never think of a long time ahead. I always thought, like, I'd be able to go back home maybe in next month. Or, you literally kind of living day by day. So there was nothing like looking ahead for many years, But then while we were working in the radio, we got quite some training. The first by the former BBC Burmese section head. He came and trained us. So he kind of increased the level of our knowledge in journalism. And then another ex-BBC Burmese section journalist, quite senior, and he came and worked with us for several years. And that really helped a lot. And then I got the chance to study like 3 months journalism course at the Domsum Foundation. So you learn more and more into journalism. And the same with my other colleagues. But then the funny thing, not the funny thing, but then the more you go into the journalism and kind of realize, like, when you have a microphone, you can say whatever you want, right? But if we're doing exactly the same as the Burmese military, we know different. So that's like after 10 years. Because in the beginning, we report a lot about exile activities, what they're doing, but not so much like news, But the more we study, the more we learn about journalism. It's not the way it works, right? It has to be about the people. So we become more and more independent from the opposition group, and there were lots of anger among the opposition group, who are my friends, from ABSCF, from ethnic groups. We try to explain to them, it's not like we are shifting away from democratic movement, but only the way we walk. It's a different. Some people understand, some people don't. But what I want is, we want to have a respect and the trust from our audience, not just from the general public audience, but also from the Burmese army people, Burmese military government. I want them to know that we're telling the truth, and then by telling the truth, they will sort of give us a respect, because these guys are not doing propaganda, they're not lying, they're telling the truth, even though they may not like it because we're telling the truth, right? And I think it turned out to be quite positive, because when we moved back in, we realized, they were like quietly praising us. Like we met some of the people in the Ministry of Information who has been working for decades. And I also met like one of the ministry official, and he told me like, I had to listen to your broadcast every night. I have to write down everything and report it back to the authority or the higher level, government official. And they even, the top army guys, they were really sort of respecting us.
This is interesting, describing the journey from activism to journalism. And so often in Burmese history, the cycles that continue to repeat themselves are just to a T sometimes. And when you follow what happened in previous conflicts and this one, we're just seeing those same cycles continuing to occur. And one of those cycles is that division between activism and journalism, the distinction between it, what the drive for people in the democracy movement to want to hear good news and want to hear news that reinforces the notion that they're on the right side of history and they're doing the right things and they're going to win in the end, which is understandable given the weight of the oppression that is being waged. And yet journalism is built upon a notion of truth, of objectivity, for whatever that means, because I'm never going to get rid of bias, but you can at least acknowledge the existence of bias and try to work within it. And I think that those activists then and now, and not just limited to Burma, but around the world where struggles are happening, I think there can be a tendency among activists to see journalism as simply a greater platform to amplify what we're already saying ourselves, rather than something that's actually going to pick apart and analyze and look at other perspectives than simply amplifying and repeating what it is you're saying. And so that's a journey that you made specifically, particularly as from an activist to a journalist, as a personal journey for you. And having to leave some friends behind, you didn't quite understand that transition. And this is something we see a lot today as well, in how Burmese journalists are trying to define themselves and some of the struggles and problems that they're having. I'm wondering, for you at that time, you mentioned that there were some kind of frayed relationships and misunderstandings among activist friends who didn't understand the shift that you were making. Do you recall any specific incidences or conversations or occurrences where you were trying to wear your newfound journalist hat and report on something in a particular manner, and an activist friend was saying, no, don't frame it that way. This is the message that we want to get out. And you were, no, well, in journalism, we have to look at it. We can't just take what you're saying. We have to look at it in a fuller context and with a greater perspective. Do you remember any particular incident where that came clashing back then?
Many, of course, not just like complaining about what we made, how we make a story, but also like some of the story that is not like good for the opposition, you got a call like right away
Mhm,
complaining
mhm,
about
mhm,
it. And you try to explain, it doesn't work that way.
mhm,
But some people, it's okay. I mean, they angry and then forget about it. But I remember, like, I was asked by our board of director to go into Thailand and explain to all the ethnic and the opposition groups, and I was pretty much grilled
mhm,
in the meeting.
mhm,
I remember one of the leader of the organization, he was saying me, you will be recorded in the history, something, very strong.
Oh no. Oh dear.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the job that, you choose. And if you point out the army what they're doing wrong, you have a duty also to point out, what the opposition are doing wrong as well. And they are also, injustice among some of the groups. And nowadays, like, some of the BDF group, they also violated human rights. In some village, we got that kind of stories, and we have to broadcast. It's not like we are trying to discredit. That's how people misunderstood. I mean, it's not us to discredit the opposition groups. It's the people themselves, who are committing the crime. It's doing the discredit for the movement. But I think it's important that, we keep telling, wherever side it's happening. It's not like you're not on this side or that side. And of course, I mean, personally, I want to see democracy in Burma, and I want to know, I mean, I do really support, what all the people are doing. But that's a different from, our daily job.
Yeah.
That what we do.
I think the difficulty is compounded by the fact that Burma has had so few years of being a free society that has sponsored the cultivation of free and critical and democratic thought, of people believing different things and following different paths. And so perhaps there could, among the audience and the readership that is facing such difficulties and repressions now, that there's also a growth or maturation that needs to go, that needs to happen, and that would happen in any free society as the years went on, of understanding what it meant to live in a free society and allow people to have different opinions, other opinions, express themselves in different ways, and realize that there was a place for something that you didn't agree with and you didn't like and you didn't want to hear, but it still had a place in society, and you could either stand up and argue against it or do your own thing and push in a different direction, or just shut it off and ignore it and go do your thing. I think this is maybe something that has to be learned.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you don't, then you are creating another dictatorship. If people can't take the criticism and try to suppress it, then gradually you will become a dictator one day. Like I remember, when we moved back into Burma, and when Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD become a government, we keep on criticizing reports about NLD government and Aung San Suu Kyi. And I remember one of the friends of mine, not him directly, but somebody asked him, like, whether DVB has already bought by a crony. And I said, why? Because they are criticizing NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi government.
Wow, it's the only way you can think to try to understand it.
Yeah.
And so that does segue into the transition, which is very interesting, and the role that a seemingly free press had, that had in so many cases been in exile, and then tenuously starts to slip and slither back into believing in a freer opening, certainly not entirely free. And we know that Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD was not particularly sympathetic towards journalists having their freedoms to be able to report and publish on things which they didn't want out there. And so as a journalist, as the head of one of the major media outfits in Myanmar at the time, what can you tell us about the experience of coming back to have a place in your actual country with a semi more democratic leadership in charge and the freedoms or restrictions that were in place at that time?
I mean, it's kind of quite disappointing in a way, to be quite frank, under Aung San Suu Kyi government, because they failed to actually, build the independent media platform or the foundation, and not build up, but also even don't care, We were like, oh, push in the corner. And of course, there is a freedom of expression. We can broadcast whatever we want. But in terms of promoting, helping the whole media sector improve, there was nothing there. And access to information is also very limited, because it's very hard to get interview with government ministers. You can forget about doing interview with Aung San Suu Kyi. We requested many times, but never accepted. And not just only the media, but also the civil society groups. They were also pretty much neglected. And that's the two area, right? When you want to build democracy stronger, these two grassroots, groups need to be strengthened, pretty much, and nothing that happened. And of course, I mean, under the same government, you don't get anything. Still, there's a freedom of expression. But it was much more easier to get access to interview requests with the minister. They are more than eager to talk to us.
In Thein Sein.
During his government time.
Why do you think that was, that his ministers were more eager to talk than Aung San Suu Kyi's?
No, I mean, they realize there's a few reasons. They one of the ministers even told me, if I talk to you, people believe, and people watch more than they watch our state TV. So that's the one reason. And another reason, I think, is basically, they're not actually a legitimate government. They knew themselves. They cheated the election in 2010.
Interesting.
Right? So they knew themselves pretty well that they were not really legitimate government. And they needed legitimacy, somehow, and reconnection from the international community. So they are kind of using us, to prove like they are committed for the change. So that's why I think they try to please us too, right? Willing to talk to us
And so, looking at what Aung San Suu Kyi's administration did during those years and not strengthening the two pillars of what a greater democratic society would be, you mentioned civil society as one, and journalists, free journalism and press on the other. There's the question I want to ask is if you think that this not just negligence, but in some ways actual resistance and obstacles that were placed to these groups, if this helped to pave the way towards the coup taking place. This is the question I want to ask, but I want to preload that with what we always hear on the other side, that we do have to acknowledge the context, that those defenders will say, look, she was never in full control. She was so afraid of a coup happening. We had Sean Turnell on the podcast 3 times, and he talked about being in her administration and that they were terrified every single day of the military. They said, we knew they were trying to do it. We knew they were just looking for any excuse at any time to be able to stop everything that we were doing. We never really felt secure that we can proceed in doing it. And so all the decisions that we were making, Sean Turnell describes, were with an understanding of how we always had to keep the military at bay. And this has been the rationale that's been explained many times of why Aung San Suu Kyi also was not just silent on the Rohingya crisis, but seemingly to defend the military at times, most famously when she made a statement literally defending the military in court. And so there's this counter argument that, as Sean Turnell and others have made, that there was this great care in having to not go too far, because if you just appease the military and you don't go too far and trigger them, it might be enough to hold them off from wanting to shut everything down, which they could do any day. On the other hand, the balance of that is, as you're saying, and many others that we've spoken to on this platform have also said, by not doing enough to support a growing democratic society and the instruments involved within a functioning democracy, that the far from being concerned about appeasing the military, it actually stemmed the progress and the growth and the strength of what could have better prevented a coup from happening in the first place. So this is a tough discussion to have, because it's also, we know what played out, we know what happened in history. Hindsight is always 20/20. So it's very easy to say that this action was right or wrong based on what actually happened and occurred. But I would also be very interested to hear your opinion of how Aung San Suu Kyi's administration, lack of encouraging journalism and civil society, how that may have played into the military's hands and then led in some way, directly or indirectly, to the 2021 coup.
I think the coup wasn't, I mean, there has been always, rumor about possibility of the coup. And we all thought, Aung San Suu Kyi is too careful about the army. I mean, the Rohingya crisis and issue was pretty obvious. But that's also not only the army, but also the general public, with when it comes to the Rohingya crisis, the general public, it's also pretty biased, I would say.
Yeah, for sure.
But why I believe like what you call NLD government, the military has pretty much power, right? Based on the constitution.
Yeah.
And that's why I thought like, even closer to the coup, the February 1st, there were like the rumor was getting stronger and stronger. But I was still thinking like, I mean, I would not expect to have the coup, but it's not because I was stupid, but because I thought they were not that stupid. Because, I mean, they have a total freedom of, running their own business, running their own army, and they are filthy rich, and not just the current military leadership, but the successive military leadership, they're extremely rich. And the Aung San Suu Kyi government, it's all become legalized, they can own it, like during Thein Sein and Tan Shui period. I mean, they may own it, but it's not legitimate, right? But under NLD government, all their wealth, it's kind of recognized. And why do they need to seize the power? They can do, still under like Rohingya crisis, they can do whatever they want, but Aung San Suu Kyi got blamed. They don't have to get blamed. They don't have to face the international community, with sanction and, all the criticism, all the criticism before it go to Aung San Suu Kyi, right? So that's why I thought they were not that stupid. And I think the only thing, it was I think more to do with a quick decision by Mayor Line and maybe some of his advisor and some of the political party that close to USDP who lost the election. I think they're giving him a wrong analysis. And then he decided, because right after the election, after the result came out, USDP party called for a press conference, and they said they want a new election, and the new election should be convened by the election commission together with the army. And then the next day, military has hold a press conference, and they said that was not their idea. They had nothing to do with this USDP announcement.
I see. Huh.
So they keep away from that. And then a few days later, they told at the press conference the election won successfully. Right. So I don't think until that point they had any idea about the coup. And I think the coup is maybe coming up, closer to the next parliamentary section around that time. And I think some of these advisors maybe telling him, just seize the power, change the constitution, because they know, they probably realize, as long as Aung San Suu Kyi is there, they could never able to come back to power. And they want to change in the constitution this one clause for proportional electoral system to spread the whole vote. And maybe his advisor telling him, you can crack down in 3 days. Everybody were quiet, just like in the 1988, in the previous time.
Yeah.
Like in 2007, the crackdown was like 3-4 days. Everything quiet.
Right.
So I think that's the belief, that they could took the power, seize the coup, and crack down with this demonstration, and change the constitution, and then run the election. But 2021 is not the 1988, right? That's what they don't believe. And I've been told, like, some of the insider, for the first 1 or 2 months, they were like very confident and they can do it. And after 4 or 5 months after the coup, they're getting like worried. And then 6-7 months later, they believe themselves like they're pretty much stuck.
Huh.
They don't know how to get out of it. And now it's, of course, even much more worse.
Before going deeper into the current conflict, we are several years now into it, which I definitely want to hit upon and follow up. I do just want to ask one more question about that transition period. And that's, you mentioned how you felt that as Aung San Suu Kyi's administration came to power, that you could report on anything. You said that you felt you really did have freedoms, and how you were able to carry your journalism. You didn't have access to so much to administrators, but you did have some sense of freedom. So were there, to expand on that, did DVB or your reporters or any stories, did you run into certain problems, and aside from access, just people not making themselves available, but aside from that access issue, did you ever run into problems of stories that you wanted to follow that you felt you would get into some serious trouble or repercussions if you went down certain pathways?
Mostly the story that related to the army and the Rohingya.
Sure.
That's the two areas that are quite difficult. And the story that related to Rohingya, because there's no access, we were brought by the government, one of our journalists, with them to visit some of the villages in Arakan, Rohingya villages. But they were not allowed to talk to anyone. That was under Aung San Suu Kyi government. So there was no access And then if we say something, then they can easily accuse, we are fabricating the story. And they are like off-limit areas, so we can't do that. And the same with the army, there was quite a few killing villagers, just like in the bus. And then we tried to get confirmation, response from the army, and it took a long time. We had to be, we had to careful with. We need to give them a chance to respond, right? That's how we can secure our back. But then it took quite some time. But that was, they did respond. Like there was one story, in fact, it was a Kachin, that was during the Aung San government, I think. It was a Kachin woman who was kidnapped and taken by the Burma army outposts in the Kachin state. And she was raped in the camp, and she wasn't allowed to leave. And in the end, I think they killed her. And we were doing the documentary about it. And in the film, we got the video footage of the girl, like, it was like on the hilltop, so the people can see her in the morning. So they film it. And then we were about to release, and then we thought we had to get a, comment and response from the army. And it took about 2 months to get an answer. And they did answer, and it was very funny. And they were excusing themselves, saying that outpost is surrounded by KIA soldiers, so they were pretty much isolated, and they couldn't leave the camp. And then the soldier became a long hair, and the woman, it's one of the soldiers.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, how creative they can be. Right. So moving to post-coup, you personally in DVB as an institution, it's very interesting to track this history over the years and decades. Your genesis is in the aftermath of the failed ABSDF ethnic army alliance that then brings out this desire to want to have an information war and to engage more in the information space as to what is happening. And then from there, you grow in exile, I imagine, before the transition period. You come back during the transition and you're actually able to report again in your home country. That's only a short-lived experiment. And then with the 2020 coup, in addition to every other media house there, has to urgently evacuate. Lives are at risk, to leave everything behind and to find some kind of home in a third country or third countries. And then everything about what you're doing has to somehow change. You have to keep your journalistic ethics and objectivity and the platform that you've built, but everything from journalist safety to funding to organization and simple logistics, everything is now thrown into question. So describe what that was like to make that sudden shift, which was unfortunately wasn't new, was something that I'm sure you've been dealing with in other years and other issues that have come up at different times, but to make a shift of that profound nature at that time with the 2021 coup, and then in the last few years, as you've had to operate in exile again, what challenges you're facing, challenges that maybe are similar to challenges of past years, as well as new challenges that this particular time in history is presenting that might stand out?
Yes, the coup, it's like, in fact, destroy everything, that we have built up once we moved back in 2012. So it's a pretty bad negative impact to, our organization and the way we want to move forward. We were really looking forward to, another 5 years under the government. we can expand a lot more area. And I mean, as you know, a journalist, because then you want to be, you know, on the ground with the public, right? And that chance has totally gone, right? We still have people working underground, but then, you know, nowadays, because of the security risks, you can't even, you know, use your own phone to film. Yeah. It's very, very risky.
Yeah.
But the biggest challenge we faced was the security of our journalists. And another problem is, you know, like before we moved in, we had lots of journalists who were working underground anonymously. And we built the network like quietly without anyone knowing it. But then when we move back in, things get normalized and they become upper ground, working openly.
Right.
But then after the coup, you can't go underground again because you're already known by the public and the government officials. And if you work in the DVB, like especially like, you know, as a reporter or news anchor, program host, like your neighbor know, people in the streets you live in, they know, you know. The police knows, and you know, the township administrator know, and you can't, no way, like, keep on walking, you know, if you live inside Burma. So we have to really start recruiting more people, new people, and that all will take times. But in outside of Burma, that's not a big problem. I mean, it took a while, you know, to get a place to re-function again, but we have been doing that for the last 20 years. So working from exile is not a huge problem. But you have to work with those inside Burma, and that's the difficult part, to rebuild a whole network of people.
What's been the most difficult thing about keeping the organization active in this time of really tumultuous change?
I mean, it's nothing really new. I mean, every year we have to struggle, you know, financially to keep running the organization, to get enough funding, because, I mean, inside Burma, we were trying to generate our own income, from TV commercial to, you know, we do all different kind of job that to generate income related to media. So we do documentary production for some NGOs, you know, UN agency. We host a talk show for different organizations. So we generate about 50% of our own income. And that's growing every year. And our focus and projection is by 2025, we will be break even. We'll be able to survive entirely by our own funding, right? But the day after the coup, the same day the coup taken, all the advertisers say, hey, please don't air my company advertising. It's from, you know, like 50% to zero, like the next day. So we had to depend entirely on funding from different donors, and that's a huge problem.
It's a big problem, and it's not just you, but we're going from an ecosystem where different Burmese media platforms with different audiences and directions and orientations, different models, we're trying to be sustainable in ways that media is anywhere in the world, through a mix of advertisements and generating their income, as you say, creative partnerships, different projects, and then of course the grants and donations being some part of that puzzle, but also being self-sustaining in a freer society, and also operating in their own territory and in their own place and region. And suddenly, overnight, you have all of these different platforms that are now occupying a very small bit of space, basically in the same place. Basically, it's much as in Mesat or Chiang Mai or somewhere in Mizoram or part of India. There's exceptions, but mostly they're all occupying this very small bit of space and also reporting on very similar issues, because what else matters right now but different nature of the conflict. And then importantly, having to rely on largely the same funders and the same donor organizations to keep all of them alive, which is in everyone's interest to be able to have a diverse media ecosystem that's able to respond to this crisis. And so this is a really dramatic change that's not just DVB's survival, but a survival of independent media, which is now almost, from my understanding, entirely dependent on a small number of donor organizations to keep it afloat, which is not really good for anyone, not good for media, not good for the people, not good for the donor organizations. But it's the situation that we're in because everything was trashed with the coup. And so what does it mean for independent media and journalism to find itself in this peculiar situation and to be dependent largely on a similar one stream funding source to be able to survive and to play its critical role in the nation and country going forward?
It's a pretty hard. I mean, we have been trying to, find different revenue stream. Like, for example, we have created this membership, like pay membership, like, but it's very hard. I mean, people attitude, every day you come to our website, our Facebook page, you get it for free.
Yeah.
And it's very hard for people to change their mind. Like, why should I start paying?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a difficult thing. And I mean, the independent media survivor, it's not just Burma, but everywhere.
Exactly.
Right? It's facing a huge problem.
Yeah.
Because the advertising funding is going into digital, and then even in the digital, it go into social media. It's a kind of an international trend, right? But then again, when it comes to news channel, news doesn't make money, but it costs lots of money to produce news, right? And you need some kind of funding to keep as an independent. I remember, when we were in Burma, we see the Chinese like really moving around and try to buy different media organization groups, and when you get funding from the Western countries, they don't come in and interfere with your editorial. You're completely independent, right? But the Chinese, I mean, they want their own propaganda. They want to publish their editorial, friendly editorial lines, that kind of thing. So we have to keep pretty much away from them, and not just only them, but also like different military cronies, who want to buy up. And once you get them in, then you can't be independent anymore. So somehow, to keep independent, you need like donor who are interested in independent news and information. And especially, that's what I try to convince the donor, like, especially these days, with lots of fake news, propaganda, disinformation. You need the independent media who people can trust, believe in their credibility, and you need to counter those information.
What do you find is the most difficult thing in reporting on this particular conflict going forward? We've referenced this a bit before about the separation and transition from activism to journalism, and this is something that we still see today, that you're not a service to simply amplify the resistance voice, that you need to be objective, you need to hold things to certain standards of accountability. And then you also have an audience that, as we've mentioned, largely wants to hear good news. Understandably, it's difficult to hear when when there's a belief that anything that shows strength or resilience of the military, people want to see it fall. We all want to see it fall, but we also have to be truthful in describing events as they're unfolding. So with this in mind, or perhaps something else, what do you find as one of the challenges that has really stood out in your reporting going forward?
That's a good question. It's like right after the coup, like many of our journalists came out, and people want to hear, the opposition is winning, and some of the journalists, they themselves witness all this killing, shooting.
Mm-hmm.
They got really angry.
Mm-hmm.
So even in their own writing, become very extreme, like use the language,
I see.
Yeah. And we had to really cool them down, like, don't forget you're doing in journalism. And when you have a story that you're winning, then you get really lots of likes and followers. It's like it's like a what you call you because of course, like every journalist, they want their article to be read by many people, right? So we had to like sort of take the break, and we have like, I had to tell them, I don't want too many likes, or we don't need it, but what we need is to keep trust of the audience. If we lose that, then we finish. If people don't trust you, what you are writing, publishing, broadcasting, then we're gone, right? So that's also very hard to. Once you lost the trust, then it's very hard to rebuild. So we said, like, even the breaking news, like we don't need to break the news nowadays on the internet age. I mean, we used to break the news in the past, before 2010, 11, 12. But nowadays, like, breaking news happen on the internet and social media, right? But we need to make sure like it is true. Of course, sometimes we make mistake, but not like should not be happening more often. So that's the sort of way we want to go. We don't want like clickbait story, we don't want sensational story, but we want to keep a high standard when it comes to our reporting.
You talked about difficulties under the NLD administration and some of the obstacles you faced in access and what you were able to report on, specifically Rohingya and military matters. How would you characterize NUG? I know that NUG is not actually in control in the way a normal government is, but when you try to report on what the NUG or the NUCC or CRPH is doing, or even if you want to look at the EAOs, EROs, different, or PDFs, we could keep going on. But when you're looking at reporting on, we can call them some of these authorities, these organizations, and you're trying to report objectively on them, you're trying to get access to tell their stories and confirm things with them and understand who they are, as any good journalist would want to do, and have the freedom to report on what you would like to. What kind of access or pushback or obstacles do you feel among these groups?
There's no particular accident with NUG or the other opposition. I mean, in terms of our reporting, and it's usually very quick response. Like when we ask for question, I mean, we do an interview with NUG ministers, their other departments. The only thing is the communication. I mean, if you want to get in touch with PDF inside Burma, sometimes they have no internet, Only the technical kind of a problem. We haven't I don't think any complaint or.
Great, yeah.
And thank you so much for, doing this interview. I really look forward to listening myself on your podcast channel.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode. Being a small, mostly volunteer team, our production time for a single episode before the coup was sometimes as long as 4 months from start to finish. While we worked at decreasing the lead time, the fastest we were ever able to manage was just around 3 weeks. Yet during this current crisis, where even a single day's events can produce such shocking news and urgent needs, we simply don't have the luxury of time. So we have worked around the clock to substantially shorten the length of our production cycle. The turnaround for some episodes is now just 36 hours. However, we cannot accomplish this goal without your support. If you have found value in today's episode and think others might also benefit from this type of content, please consider making a donation so that we can continue our mission. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause in both websites except credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give in another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.